A doomed scholar corrected the Alpha King's grammar, then accidentally became his queen. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our channel's new videos. It is quick, it is free, and it is one of the best ways to support us as we continue bringing you more dramatic, emotional, and unforgettable stories like this one. Your support truly means the world to us. And before we begin, tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and what time it is where you are right now. We love seeing how far these stories travel and discovering who is joining us from around the world today. Now, let's begin today's story. Your Majesty, that sentence does not mean what you think it means. The words escaped Julian Reed's mouth before common sense could stop them, and the royal archive fell so silent that he could hear the faint ticking of the enormous brass clock 3 rooms away. Julian stood beneath a vaulted ceiling painted with generations of Alpha Kings, clutching a weathered manuscript against his chest, while 24 royal scholars stared at him as though he had just corrected a thunderstorm. Perhaps he had. At the far end of the chamber stood King Adrian Wolfe, 30 years old, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, and dressed in the midnight blue uniform of Aurelian's royal house. His reputation had traveled farther than the kingdom's borders. Adrian was an alpha who could silence ministers with a glance, yet Julian had just interrupted him over grammar. Under ordinary circumstances, Julian would have apologized immediately. His circumstances, however, had stopped being ordinary months ago. Julian was 24, penniless, and supposedly doomed to die before his 25th birthday because of a mysterious condition that had followed the men of his family for generations. With so little future left, fear had begun to feel like an expensive luxury. Adrian slowly lowered the ancient parchment in his hand. "You are correcting me?" he asked. Julian swallowed. "Technically, Your Majesty, I am correcting whoever translated that document 300 years ago." Several scholars looked horrified. Adrian did not. Something almost resembling curiosity appeared in his gray eyes. The ceremony had been intended to commemorate the founding of Aurelian. Adrian was supposed to read one famous sentence from the kingdom's oldest surviving royal law: "The king shall choose his queen." Julian had spent years studying the forgotten language in which the law had originally been written, and the translation had bothered him from the moment he saw it. "Explain," Adrian said. Julian stepped toward the parchment. Every instinct told him to retreat, but scholarship had always been the one place where he trusted himself. The word translated as queen is incorrect. It does not describe gender, rank, or even marriage. Murmurs swept through the chamber. Adrian's expression sharpened. Then what does it describe? Julian studied the faded symbols again. The answer seemed impossible, yet the grammar was unmistakable. "A companion," he said softly. More precisely, a soul recognized as completing another. The murmuring stopped. Adrian glanced toward the assembled council before returning his attention to Julian. "Read the entire sentence correctly." Julian hesitated. For centuries, nobody had questioned these words. Now an obscure Omega scholar with months left to live was about to challenge the foundation of a royal tradition. He drew a careful breath. "The crown shall recognize the soul who completes the king." Something warm flashed across the room. Julian looked down. The ancient silver ring on Adrian's hand, an heirloom said to have belonged to Aurelian's first Alpha King, had begun glowing with pale golden light. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Adrian stared at the ring, then at Julian. One by one, the royal scholars dropped to their knees. Julian remained standing, completely bewildered. The oldest counselor turned pale and whispered words Julian had never expected to hear. "The crown has chosen." Adrian's gaze never left Julian's face. "Chosen him for what?" The counselor swallowed. "Your Majesty, according to the oldest law, the scholar is your royal companion." Julian nearly dropped his manuscript. He had entered the palace expecting punishment for a translation dispute. Somehow, by correcting one sentence, he had just become the most important person in the kingdom. For several long seconds, Julian could only stare at the glowing ring on Adrian's hand. The words royal companion seemed to hang in the archive like an impossible verdict. Then Julian found his voice. "There has been a mistake." The oldest counselor looked scandalized. "The first crown does not make mistakes." Julian lifted the manuscript. "People make mistakes constantly. I discovered one less than a minute ago. A few scholars lowered their eyes, apparently trying not to react. Adrian noticed. To Julian's surprise, the Alpha King's mouth almost curved into a smile. He has a point. That only made the council more uncomfortable. Within an hour, Julian was escorted from the archive to a private chamber overlooking the palace gardens. He expected guards, interrogations, perhaps even a formal accusation. Instead, Adrian arrived carrying 3 ancient books. He placed them on the table between them. Prove it wrong. Julian blinked. Prove what wrong? The recognition. You believe this is an error. So do I find it. For the first time that day, Julian felt something close to relief. Gladly, they spent the afternoon examining royal records while officials waited anxiously outside. Julian expected Adrian to become impatient. Instead, the king listened. Whenever Julian challenged a translation, Adrian asked why. Whenever Adrian questioned an interpretation, Julian defended it with grammar, context, and historical usage. Nobody had ever argued with Adrian so comfortably, and nobody had ever taken Julian's scholarship so seriously. By sunset, the table had disappeared beneath books and parchment. Julian finally found the passage they needed. Here, Adrian moved beside him. Julian pointed to a faded line. This word has been translated as queen for nearly 3 centuries, but that is impossible. Why? Because the original word existed centuries before Aurelian used gendered royal titles. It means companion, counterpart, someone who stands beside. Adrian studied the page. Not beneath. Julian looked up, never beneath. Something changed in Adrian's expression. Julian could not name it, but the king's usual distance briefly disappeared. Adrian turned toward the window. My counsel has spent my entire reign telling me what a king must never question. That sounds inconvenient. Adrian glanced back. You corrected me in front of 24 scholars. That was also inconvenient. This time Adrian actually smiled. It transformed him so completely that Julian forgot, for one dangerous second, that he was speaking to a king. Then the door opened, and 3 counselors entered. Their faces were grim. Your Majesty, preparations must begin immediately. The kingdom will expect an announcement regarding your queen. Julian stood. I am not his queen. The crown recognized you. The crown recognized a companion. Your translation invented the rest. The counselors froze. Adrian returned to the table and read the passage again. How certain are you? Completely. Silence followed. Then Adrian closed the book. Until this is understood, nobody will announce anything. The counselors protested, but Adrian raised one hand, and the room quieted. Julian realized something unsettling. Adrian was not merely allowing him to question tradition. He was protecting his right to do it. After they left, Julian noticed another line beneath the passage, written in older ink and nearly erased. He leaned closer. Adrian. It was the first time he had forgotten to say Your Majesty. Neither man corrected it. What is it? Julian traced the faded symbols without touching them. This is not just a marriage law. His pulse quickened as the forgotten language revealed its meaning. It says the crown companion must preserve the truth when the kingdom forgets it. Adrian's eyes narrowed. Forgets what? Julian looked at the rows of altered translations surrounding them. I think someone changed your history. By midnight, Julian had stopped believing the altered translation was an accident. He and Adrian sat alone beneath the amber lamps of the royal archive, surrounded by records spanning nearly 700 years, and the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Every early document used the same ancient word Julian had translated as companion. Then, 3 centuries ago, the language changed. Companion became queen. Sacred bond became royal marriage. Most strangely, entire passages disappeared. Someone did not mistranslate history, Julian said quietly. Someone rewrote it. Adrian stood across the table, his gray eyes fixed on 2 versions of the same royal decree. Why? Julian rubbed his tired eyes. His supposed final birthday was approaching, yet instead of fearing death, he was investigating a mystery that seemed older than his entire family. Because words decide what later generations believe was normal. Adrian looked at him. Julian continued. Change enough words, and eventually nobody remembers there was another truth. Adrian was silent for a moment. Then we find the original truth. They moved deeper into the archive, where older books were stored behind ironwood doors. Julian discovered references to something called the first bond, a tradition practiced before the modern royal court existed. The surviving fragments described alpha kings choosing companions through affection, trust, and a mysterious recognition by the crown. Some companions had been omegas. Others had been alphas. Julian stopped reading. Adrian. The king came closer. Julian showed him the passage. Two men were named together in the oldest royal genealogy, both described with the same sacred phrase used for bonded companions. Male alpha romance. Julian whispered, translating the archaic heading. It was recognized by royal law. Adrian's expression hardened with disbelief, not disgust. There is no mention of this in our modern histories. That is exactly the problem. Julian searched another volume and found the names again, but thick black ink had been drawn across one of them generations ago. Someone had systematically erased male companions from Aurelian's official history. Adrian slowly sat down. For the first time, Julian saw not a powerful alpha king, but a man discovering that the traditions used to define his life had been deliberately narrowed by people long dead. My tutors taught me that the crown recognized only one kind of union. Adrian said. They were teaching what they had been taught, Julian replied. That does not make them cruel, but it does not make the lesson true. Adrian looked toward him. You always defend people while correcting them. I prefer correcting ideas. A quiet warmth entered Adrian's eyes. That may be why the crown chose you. Julian's heart stumbled at the sincerity in his voice. He quickly returned to the documents and noticed a small symbol pressed into the corner of one damaged page. It resembled a circle divided by 3 narrow lines. Julian went still. He knew that mark. His father had drawn it inside every book Julian owned as a child. His grandfather had worn it on a silver pendant. Julian had always been told it represented the curse carried by the men of their family. What is wrong? Adrian asked. Julian pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat. On it was the physician's copied record of the mark associated with his mysterious condition. He placed it beside the ancient page. The symbols matched perfectly. Adrian leaned closer. Your family is connected to this. Julian barely heard him. Beneath the symbol was a sentence written in an older dialect than anything else they had found. He translated slowly. When the forgotten bond returns, seek the child removed from the crown. Adrian's face lost its color. There has only been one royal child removed from our family records. Julian looked at him. Adrian's voice became almost a whisper. My younger brother, Elias. He disappeared 23 years ago. I was told he died. Julian looked back at the ancient symbol, suddenly understanding that the altered history, his family's secret, and the crown's recognition were not separate mysteries. Somewhere inside Aurelian's forgotten past was the truth about Julian himself, and perhaps about a lost prince who had never been meant to disappear. Adrian did not speak about Elias again until sunrise. Julian understood why. Some questions were painful not because they lacked answers, but because finding the answers could change every memory that came before them. By morning, however, secrecy was no longer possible. The royal council had learned that Julian was examining restricted histories, and 12 senior officials assembled in the council chamber demanding that the scholar be removed from the palace. Julian stood alone before the long oak table, while Adrian listened from the raised royal seat. This Omega has already disrupted a sacred ceremony, Lord Harrington declared. Now he questions 3 centuries of accepted law. Julian kept his hands folded behind his back. Accepted law and accurately translated law are not necessarily the same thing. Several counselors reacted with immediate disapproval. Harrington leaned forward. You presume that generations of royal scholars were less capable than you. No, I presume that generations of scholars trusted the books placed before them. That answer silenced the room for a moment. Julian looked toward Adrian, expecting the king to end the argument. Instead, Adrian asked, what does the original law say? Julian realized Adrian was giving him something more valuable than protection. He was giving him permission to speak for himself. Julian stepped toward the center table and opened the oldest surviving copy of the first crown law. The modern version says the king chooses a queen who serves the crown. The original says something different. It says the crown recognizes a companion who stands beside the king and preserves truth when power forgets it. Harrington shook his head. One scholar cannot overturn history. Then do not believe me, Julian replied. Believe the grammar. He showed them the verb forms, the erased passages, and the older definitions. He explained each point patiently, without insulting anyone who had believed the later translation. The room gradually changed. Doubt replaced outrage. Curiosity replaced certainty. Adrian descended from his seat and stood beside Julian. For years, the king said, "You have advised me that tradition creates stability. Perhaps it does. But stability built upon an error is only an error that has survived for a long time." Harrington stared at him. "Your Majesty, the dignity of the crown must be protected." Adrian's voice remained calm. "A crown that fears correction deserves to be corrected." Julian turned toward him, startled by the words. Adrian did not look away. For the first time in Julian's life, someone powerful was not asking him to become quieter so others could remain comfortable. The council session ended without Julian's removal. That evening, they returned to the archive together. Adrian brought coffee instead of royal attendance, setting one cup beside Julian without ceremony. "You remembered how I take it?" Julian asked. "You complained yesterday that sugar ruins good coffee." "I did not complain." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "You delivered a 7-minute argument." Julian smiled despite himself. The warmth between them frightened him more than the council had. Adrian was beginning to feel less like a king from a distant world and more like someone Julian could imagine knowing beyond books and laws. That was dangerous. Julian had spent his entire life believing he would not survive past 25. He could not allow himself to build a future inside another person's heart. He turned away and opened the manuscript connected to Elias. "We should work." Adrian noticed the retreat, but did not challenge it. Hours later, Julian discovered that the mysterious family symbol appeared on a sealed catalog entry. The document referenced an object removed from the royal nursery 23 years earlier, a children's language primer belonging to Prince Elias Wolf. Beside the entry was a handwritten instruction. "Do not destroy. The child may return for it." Julian stared at the sentence. Adrian went completely still beside him. Then Julian noticed something even stranger. The handwriting was familiar. He had seen those exact letters throughout his childhood, written inside old books and birthday cards. "Adrian," Julian whispered. "The person who hid your brother's book was my grandfather." Julian recognized his grandfather's handwriting before his mind could accept what it meant. Samuel Reed had been a quiet man who repaired books for village schools, corrected Julian's Latin at breakfast, and insisted that every word carried a responsibility. Nothing about him had suggested a connection to a vanished prince. Adrian carefully removed the catalog entry from the table. Where would your grandfather hide something he believed a royal child might return for? Julian remembered an old saying Samuel repeated whenever Julian misplaced a book. The safest secret is hidden inside a lesson everyone thinks they already know. Julian looked at Adrian. The primer. They requested the sealed collection immediately. An hour later, an archivist brought them a narrow cedar box that had not been opened in 23 years. Inside rested a children's language book, its blue cover faded with age. Adrian touched the embossed royal crest with unusual tenderness. "I remember this." His voice softened. Elias carried it everywhere. Julian opened the book carefully. The first pages contained simple vocabulary exercises, but the later pages made no sense. Certain letters were written in different colors, and several sentences contained grammatical errors so obvious that Julian almost laughed. Then he understood. They are deliberate. Adrian leaned closer. "The mistakes. Your brother was leaving a message." Julian copied every incorrect letter onto a blank sheet. Rearranged according to an ancient linguistic pattern, they formed a sentence. "When the false words rule the crown, follow the true name west." Beneath it appeared another phrase Julian had never encountered before. The pure word. They searched until Julian found a reference in a religious manuscript older than Aurelian itself. The pure word was described not as magic of conquest, but as a sacred gift of understanding. Its bearer could sense the original meaning hidden beneath corrupted language, recognizing when sacred words had been altered from their first intent. According to the manuscript, the gift appeared only rarely and could not be commanded by rank. Elias had this. Adrian asked. Julian turned another page of the primer. A note written by Samuel Reed answered him. The prince hears truth inside language. Protect him until the crown remembers what it has forgotten. Adrian lowered himself into a chair. For 23 years, he had believed his little brother was gone. Now, every clue suggested Elias had been deliberately removed from royal life because he possessed knowledge. Someone feared. Julian continued decoding. A map emerged from the children's exercises, pointing toward the western mountains, nearly 200 miles from the capital. Then Julian discovered a final message written in Elias's childish hand. Adrian will become a good king because he listens even when the truth hurts. Adrian closed his eyes. Julian said nothing. He simply sat beside him, allowing the silence to remain gentle. After a moment, Adrian whispered, "He was 7. Then he believed in you when he was 7. Adrian looked at Julian, and the distance between king and scholar seemed smaller than ever. "And you believe we can find him?" Julian considered everything they had uncovered. "I believe somebody wanted him hidden, not forgotten." Adrian's hand rested near Julian's on the table, close without demanding contact. "Then we find my brother together." Julian wanted to say yes immediately, but another discovery stopped him. On the final page of the primer was the same sacred symbol carried by Julian's family. Beneath it, Samuel had written one last instruction, addressed not to Elias, but to his own descendants. When the final keeper approaches his 25th year, the seal will awaken. Julian's breath caught. His supposed curse had a name now. A seal. And whatever would happen on his 25th birthday had never been an illness at all. Julian read his grandfather's final sentence 3 times before the meaning settled over him. For years, every physician his family consulted had treated his approaching 25th birthday like an invisible cliff. Samuel had never called it death. He had called it awakening. Adrian immediately ordered the oldest Reed family records brought from the restricted archive, but Julian was already searching the primer. The symbol appeared beside a sequence of ancient words he had previously assumed were decorative. Now they seemed almost familiar. "I can understand this," Julian whispered. Adrian looked over his shoulder. "You studied this dialect?" "No." That answer frightened Julian more than the supposed curse ever had. He touched one faded line and somehow knew that the accepted translation was wrong before. Consciously reading it, the manuscript described the Reed family as keepers of the pure word, guardians chosen not to rule, but to preserve the original meaning of sacred law whenever ambition attempted to reshape it. Their gift had been sealed across generations for protection. At the age of 25, the final keeper would either awaken to it or allow it to disappear forever. Julian sat back, stunned. "My family spent generations believing this was a curse." Adrian studied the manuscript. Perhaps they were supposed to believe that. Julian found another passage confirming it. The false story had protected the keepers by making their inheritance appear undesirable. No ambitious noble would search for sacred power inside a family expecting tragedy. Julian gave a quiet, disbelieving laugh. "My grandfather hid one truth inside another." "He taught you to question words," Adrian said. "He prepared you without telling you why." The realization was strangely comforting. Julian had spent his life measuring time by what he expected to lose. Suddenly, there might be years beyond 25. A future. The thought should have filled him only with joy, yet his eyes drifted toward Adrian. A future meant choices Julian had never permitted himself to imagine. Adrian seemed to understand. "You do not have to decide anything about the crown because of this." Julian looked at him. "The ring chose me. A ring recognized something. It does not own you." Adrian's voice was quiet but certain. "Neither does tradition. Neither do I." Julian felt the words more deeply than any royal declaration. "And if breaking the seal means the crown no longer recognizes me?" Adrian answered without hesitation. "Then the crown can learn disappointment." Julian laughed before he could stop himself. Adrian smiled. "I did not begin trusting you because you were chosen. I trusted you because you walked into my archive with every reason to remain silent and told me I was wrong. Your grammar was wrong. You see? That." Their laughter faded into a comfortable silence. Julian realized their bond had grown without either of them naming it. Adrian valued his mind rather than his status as an Omega. Julian saw the man beneath the Alpha King's authority. Whatever existed between them had not been commanded by ancient law. It had been built through listening. Then the manuscript beneath Julian's hand grew faintly warm. Pale golden lines appeared across the page, revealing writing that had been invisible moments earlier. Julian read it aloud. "The final keeper shall open the western sanctuary when truth and crown arrive together." Adrian's expression changed. "Western sanctuary. the same direction Elias encoded. Another line appeared. Julian's new understanding seemed to unlock each word before his eyes. The lost prince guards the First Testament until the companion returns. Adrian stared at him. Julian felt his pulse quicken. Elias was not merely connected to the mystery. He was waiting at its center. And according to a message hidden for 23 years, he had been waiting for Julian. The western mountains rose from the horizon like a wall of blue stone, and somewhere beyond them, Adrian's lost brother was waiting beside a truth powerful enough to reshape Aurelian. Julian and Adrian left the capital before sunrise with only a small royal escort, following the route hidden inside Elias's childhood primer. For nearly 200 miles, the clues led them away from paved roads and royal estates until they reached a quiet valley surrounded by pine-covered slopes. There was no fortress waiting there, no hidden palace, only an old stone library beside a clear mountain lake. Julian stopped at the entrance. Ancient words had been carved above the doorway. "Truth requires no throne," he translated. Adrian stared at the inscription. "That sounds like something my brother would enjoy reminding me." Julian smiled. "I already like him." The wooden door opened before either man could knock. A tall, fair-skinned alpha with dark hair touched by silver stood inside. His gray eyes were unmistakably similar to Adrian's. Nobody spoke. 23 years disappeared in a single look. "You took your time," the stranger finally said. Adrian's composure broke into a breathless laugh. "Elias." The man's expression softened. "Hello, Adrian." Their reunion was quiet, almost uncertain at first, as though both brothers feared that moving too quickly might turn the moment into a dream. Julian stepped away, giving them space. When Elias finally looked toward him, however, recognition appeared immediately. Samuel Reed's grandson. Julian froze. "You knew my grandfather?" "He saved the truth of this kingdom." Elias invited them inside. The library extended deep beneath the mountain, filled with manuscripts Julian had never seen listed in any royal catalog. Elias explained that he had not spent 23 years imprisoned. He had been protected. When his pure word awakened as a child, he began noticing contradictions in royal documents. Certain officials feared what he might eventually reveal, so Samuel and several trusted scholars secretly removed him from court and created the story of his death. "Why did you never return?" Adrian asked, pain beneath the question. Elias looked toward shelves filled with ancient records. "Because returning too soon would have turned truth into a struggle for power. I needed to protect the First Testament until Aurelian had a king willing to hear it." Adrian lowered his gaze. "You could have trusted me." "I did." Elias smiled sadly. "That is why I left the message in my primer." He then led them to a circular chamber where a single white book rested beneath a shaft of sunlight. Julian felt the seal inside him respond before he touched it. Golden symbols appeared across the cover. Elias nodded. "The pure word recognizes another keeper." Julian opened the First Testament, and meaning flowed through him with startling clarity. The earliest kings of Aurelian had misunderstood nothing. The crown had never been designed to choose a ruler's spouse according to gender or secondary status. It recognized a person whose honesty could balance royal authority. Male alpha romance had once been openly honored alongside other sacred bonds because the oldest law judged character, not expectation. Adrian read silently beside him. "So the crown does not give a king absolute authority." "No," Julian said. "It limits him." Elias smiled. "Exactly. The crown's sacred purpose was not to prove that a king was always right. It was to ensure someone could stand beside him and tell him when he was wrong." Adrian looked at Julian, and suddenly their first meeting seemed less accidental. "That explains the grammar." Julian almost laughed. "Your grammar remains indefensible." Elias watched them with visible amusement before turning serious. "There is one final passage." Julian read it, and his expression changed. The First Testament declared that whenever the ancient bond returned after an age of silence, the reigning king must choose between preserving the comfortable history of the crown or revealing its original truth to the kingdom. Adrian understood immediately. Returning home would mean challenging centuries of tradition in public. "What happens if I refuse?" he asked. Elias answered softly. "You keep your throne exactly as it is." Adrian looked at Julian. "And if I tell the truth?" Elias closed the ancient book. Then you discover whether Aurelian loves its traditions more than it loves the truth. Adrian returned to Aurelian with the truth beside him and his lost brother riding only a few yards behind. Yet the hardest part of the journey began when the palace gates opened. News of Elias's return spread through the capital before sunset. By morning, the royal council had assembled, the galleries were filled, and thousands of citizens waited beyond the palace courtyard for an explanation. Julian stood beside Adrian holding the First Testament while Elias remained near the ancient royal seal. Lord Harrington spoke first. "Your Majesty, the kingdom can welcome Prince Elias home without disturbing centuries of law. We can recognize Scholar Reed as your queen and preserve stability." Julian felt every eye turn toward him. Weeks earlier, the suggestion would have seemed absurd. Now it sounded worse. It sounded convenient. "No," Julian said. Harrington stared at him. "You would reject the highest position available to an Omega? I reject a title created by changing the meaning of another." The chamber fell silent. Julian opened the First Testament. The original law never called the crown companion a queen. It never required that person to be an Omega. It never required that person to be a woman. Those conditions were added centuries later, after parts of Aurelian's history were deliberately erased. Uneasy murmurs traveled through the galleries. Harrington turned to Adrian. "Surely your Majesty understands the danger of presenting ancient customs as superior to the society we have built." Adrian rose. "That is not what we are doing. We are admitting that our society inherited an incomplete truth." Elias stepped forward and confirmed the authenticity of the testament, explaining the sacred pure word and the duty of its keepers. Then he revealed the oldest records of Aurelian's royal companions, including male alpha partners whose names had disappeared from modern histories. Some people looked shocked. Others simply listened. Julian realized that change rarely arrived as one dramatic moment. Sometimes it began when people were finally allowed to hear what had been hidden from them. Harrington made one final appeal. "If every tradition can be questioned, what remains sacred?" Adrian looked toward Julian before answering. "Truth, choice, human dignity, love freely given. Those seem sacred enough." Julian felt his throat tighten. Adrian descended from the royal platform and stopped beside him, deliberately standing at the same level. "The crown recognized Julian Reed," Adrian said, "but recognition is not ownership. He will not receive a title he does not choose." Then Adrian faced Julian rather than the council. "What do you choose?" Julian remembered the life he had expected to lose at 25, the future he had refused to imagine, and the Alpha King who had never once demanded that Julian become smaller to stand beside him. "I choose the truth," Julian said, "and I choose you, but I will stand beside you as myself." Adrian smiled. "Then that is enough." Elias opened the First Testament to its oldest declaration. Before the gathered kingdom, the forgotten title was restored, crown companion. Not servant, not ornament, not possession, companion. The ancient ring on Adrian's hand glowed again. But this time Julian understood why. The light was not commanding him toward a predetermined destiny. It was recognizing a choice both men had already made freely. Adrian extended his hand. Julian took it. Beyond the palace doors, bells began ringing across the capital. Their sound traveled over rooftops, schools, markets, and ordinary homes where people would soon learn that a forgotten part of their history had returned. Julian looked toward Elias, the lost prince who had protected that truth for 23 years, then toward Adrian, the Alpha King willing to surrender comfortable certainty rather than preserve a lie. For centuries, Aurelian had believed tradition was strongest when nobody questioned it. That day, the kingdom discovered something greater. Truth did not destroy what was worthy of keeping. It revealed what had been worthy all along. 3 years later, Julian Reed still corrected the king in public. The difference was that nobody gasped anymore. On a bright autumn morning, Julian stood inside the newly opened Free Royal Archive, watching children race between shelves that had once been reserved for nobles and royal scholars. Sunlight poured through tall windows onto reading tables filled with students from every corner of Aurelian. Some wore expensive coats. Others arrived in patched sweaters from farming towns hundreds of miles away. Inside these walls, none of that mattered. Knowledge belonged to everyone now. Julian had survived his 25th birthday without tragedy. When the ancient seal finally awakened, There had been no terrible ending. Only a quiet golden light across the family symbol and a sudden clarity that allowed him to understand fragments of the pure word once hidden from him. He had learned something important afterward. A sacred gift did not make him wiser than everyone else. It simply gave him a greater responsibility to listen carefully before claiming he understood. Elias understood that better than anyone. The lost prince had refused every ceremonial position the council offered him and instead became keeper of the ancient language, dividing his time between the mountain sanctuary and the capital. Under his guidance, forgotten manuscripts were being restored rather than rewritten. The erased names of ancient male companions had returned to the official histories, including alpha partners once honored openly by the earliest kings. Their stories were taught not as scandals or exceptions, but as pieces of Aurelian that had always existed. Adrian changed too. He remained decisive, disciplined, and occasionally impossible before breakfast, but his court had become known for something previous generations considered weakness: disagreement. Adrian invited scholars, farmers, merchants, omegas, betas, and alphas to challenge royal proposals before they became law. Julian once asked whether constantly hearing that he might be wrong was exhausting. Adrian replied that being wrong without anyone brave enough to tell him sounded far worse. Their relationship grew in the same way, not through prophecy, but through ordinary choices repeated every day. Adrian listened when Julian needed independence. Julian stayed when Adrian needed honesty rather than praise. Neither man completed the other because either had been incomplete alone. They simply made each other's lives larger. One evening, after the archive closed, Julian found Adrian sitting at his desk beneath the enormous brass clock where their story had begun. A sheet of paper waited before him. "I wrote something," Adrian said. Julian immediately became suspicious. Should I summon the royal grammarians? I dismissed them for excessive fear. Julian took the page. Adrian watched him with unmistakable amusement as his eyes moved across the sentence. Julian remained silent for several seconds. "Well," Adrian asked, "is the grammar wrong again?" Julian looked up. "Terrible." Adrian laughed. "I knew inviting you into my life was dangerous." Julian smiled and returned his attention to the sentence. It read, "No crown makes one soul worthy of another. Love does." Julian considered correcting the punctuation purely out of principle, then placed the page inside the first volume of the restored royal history. "Keep it exactly as it is," he said. Adrian raised an eyebrow. "You are allowing imperfect grammar into the royal archive?" For historical accuracy. Outside the windows, evening bells carried across a kingdom that had learned its past could be questioned without losing its future. Elias had recovered his name. Julian had recovered the years he thought he would never have. Adrian had discovered that authority became stronger when it made room for truth. And the ancient crown had revealed its simplest lesson at last. Love was never sacred because tradition approved it. Love became sacred when two people could stand beside each other freely, see each other clearly, and still choose to remain.